Vivian's never amounted to anything worthwhile. Best decision we ever made was cutting her off. She'll come crawling back eventually, but we're done throwing good money after bad. The voice was unmistakable. My father, Harry Crawford, speaking, at their annual neighborhood barbecue. A video sent to me by my childhood friend Nicky, who thought I should know what my parents were saying behind my back. I watched the clip again, my mother Lorna nodding along beside him, adding, "She always thought she was too good for us anyway." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I stared at my phone screen in disbelief, the video freezing on my parents' smug expressions as they stood in the backyard of the house I grew up in. The same house they were now struggling to keep, 3 years. That's how long it had been since I'd left home after that final explosive argument. 3 years of building my life from scratch with no support system. 3 years of proving to myself that I could succeed on my own terms. And in those 3 years, I had never once badmouthed them to others. The timestamp on the video showed it was taken just yesterday. Around the same time, I was signing the final paperwork to purchase the debt on their mortgage from Heartland Financial, who was eager to offload their increasingly risky loan. My parents had no idea that their financial troubles had created an opportunity. No idea that their daughter, the same worthless daughter they were disparaging to the entire neighborhood, now held the future of their home in her hands. I set my phone down on my desk, breathing deeply to calm the mixture of hurt and anger churning inside me. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown apartment, the city sparkled in the evening light, a view I had earned through countless sleepless nights building my consulting business from nothing. "Have you watched it?" Nicky texted. "Yes," I replied. "Thank you for letting me know." "I'm so sorry, V. I thought you and your parents were working on things." I almost laughed at that. Working on things? My parents had spent my entire life making me feel like I was never quite good enough. The straight A's that should have been A+, the scholarship that should have been to a more prestigious school, the business idea that would never work and was just another one of your impractical dreams. I had accepted their criticism as normal for so long. It wasn't until college that I realized other parents didn't constantly tear down their children. That love wasn't supposed to come with the perpetual message that you were fundamentally lacking. The last straw had come during my final year of graduate school. I had developed a business plan for a specialized consulting firm that would help small businesses implement enterprise-level systems at affordable rates. I had secured seed funding, built relationships with software providers, and even signed 2 clients before graduation. When I told my parents, expecting, just once, to see pride in their eyes, they had instead launched into all the reasons I would fail. "Why can't you just get a normal job like everyone else?" my mother had demanded. "This is what we get after all the money we spent on your education?" "We've supported you for years," my father had added. "And this is how you repay us? With some pipe dream that will leave you broke and coming back to us for more handouts?" That night, I had packed my things and left. The only contact since then had been terse text exchanges about holidays and family obligations. I had tried a few times to bridge the gap, to show them that my business was thriving, that I had made the right choice. Each attempt was met with dismissal, with reminders of how I had abandoned my family. And now this, public humiliation, belittling me to neighbors who had watched me grow up. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of wine, then opened my laptop where the final confirmation from Heartland Financial sat in my inbox. Purchase of debt obligation, Crawford, Harry, and Lorna, completed. It had been a straightforward business decision when I first learned about their financial troubles. Heartland had been sending increasingly urgent notices about their mortgage. Notices that were being forwarded to their old email address. One they had forgotten to update, but that's still routed to a shared cloud account we had set up years ago. Month after month, I watched as they missed payments, made partial payments, requested extensions. The home they had always used as a symbol of their success, the home they had often implied was too good for me, was slipping away from them. As someone with liquid capital looking for investment opportunities, purchasing distressed debt made financial sense. The fact that this particular debt belonged to my parents wasn't the primary motivation. At least, that's what I told myself. But the truth was more complicated. Some part of me had hoped this might finally create a bridge between us. That helping them out of their financial crisis, discreetly, respectfully, might heal some of the wounds between us. That fantasy evaporated as I watched the video again. "She was always so ungrateful," my mother was saying to Mrs. Winters from across the street. "Everything handed to her, and she still complained." I closed the video, unable to stomach anymore. The narrative they had created bore no resemblance to reality. Nothing had been handed to me. Every achievement had been despite their criticism, not because of their support. My phone rang. Rosalie, my business partner, and the only person who knew what I had done. "Did you get the confirmation from Heartland?" she asked when I answered. "Just came through." "So what now? Are you going to tell them?" I looked out at the city lights, considering. "I don't know yet." "Viv, you don't owe them anything. Not protection, not help, and certainly not your silence about who holds their mortgage." She was right, of course. Legally, I could begin foreclosure proceedings tomorrow if I wanted to. I could force the sale of the house they had weaponized against me for years. I could make them face the same uncertainty and fear they had always been so quick to instill in me. But that wasn't who I wanted to be. "I need to think," I told Rosalie. "This isn't just about money or revenge." After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my apartment, turning over my options. The irony wasn't lost on me. My parents had spent years telling me I would never succeed, that my judgment couldn't be trusted. Now, I quite literally held their future in my hands. Tomorrow, they would receive formal notification that their mortgage had been sold. The letter wouldn't specify the buyer, just the servicing information for the new entity. A holding company I had established precisely for this purpose. They wouldn't know it was me. Not yet. And in that anonymity lay power and possibility. For the first time in our relationship, I controlled the terms of engagement. I could choose when and how they would learn the truth. I could decide what came next. The question was, what did I want this to become? A reckoning? A reconciliation? Or something else entirely? Something that would finally free me from the weight of their judgment? I placed my empty wine glass in the sink and made my decision. This wouldn't be about revenge. It would be about truth. Their truth and mine, finally brought into the light. To understand how I reached this crossroads with my parents, you need to know who Vivian Crawford was before that video arrived in my inbox. I grew up in Oak Ridge Estates, a neighborhood where appearances mattered above all else. Our colonial-style home with its manicured lawn and my father's German luxury car in the driveway projected the image my parents worked tirelessly to maintain. Harry Crawford, regional sales director for a pharmaceutical company, and Lorna Crawford, real estate agent for luxury properties, the perfect suburban power couple. Behind closed doors, our home operated on conditional love and constant evaluation. Every achievement was measured against an invisible, ever-shifting standard of perfection. Second place in the science fair? Jennifer Lewis's daughter got first, and she doesn't even have your advantages. A 94 on your math test? What happened to the other 6 points? Each success was diminished, each stumble magnified. My father's favorite refrain when I disappointed him: "This is why we can't depend on you." My mother was more subtle but equally damaging. "Oh, Vivian," she would sigh, looking me over before school or social events. "Is that really what you're wearing?" I suppose it will have to do. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The implied message was always clear. I was fundamentally inadequate. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, I became pathologically self-sufficient. By 16, I was working after school and on weekends at the local bookstore, saving every dollar. My parents saw this as further evidence of my defiance rather than my independence. "You're so determined to do everything the hard way." My mother would complain when I couldn't attend one of her carefully orchestrated family photo shoots because of work. Always making things difficult, college was my first taste of real freedom. I had secured a substantial scholarship to State University, not the Ivy League school my parents had expected, which became another perceived failure on my part. But it covered tuition and housing, meaning I only needed to work to cover my remaining expenses. In that environment, away from my parents' constant criticism, I flourished. My business professors recognized qualities in me that had always been dismissed at home: strategic thinking, innovative problem-solving, relentless work ethic. Professor Winters, my advisor, became the mentor I had always craved. "You have a natural talent for identifying inefficiencies and creating practical solutions," he told me during my junior year. "But more importantly, you have the drive to execute your ideas. That's rare." Under his guidance, I developed the concept for what would eventually become Crawford Consulting Solutions. The irony of keeping my family name for my business wasn't lost on me. Part defiance, part aspiration to redefine what Crawford would stand for. During my final year of graduate school, I lived at home to save money, a decision I soon regretted. My growing confidence and independence grated against my parents' need for control. "Business consulting? That market is saturated," my father declared over dinner the night I shared my post-graduation plans. "You'll be competing against people with decades of experience." "I've found a niche," I explained, trying to maintain my enthusiasm. "Small to mid-sized companies that need enterprise-level systems but can't afford traditional implementation. Costs. I've already developed partnerships with 3 software providers willing to—" "Oh, Vivian," my mother interrupted with that familiar sigh. "Always chasing impractical dreams instead of finding a stable position with an established firm." What they didn't know, what they never bothered to ask, was that I had secured startup funding through a business plan competition at the university. That I had already signed 2 clients for post-graduation projects. That Professor Winters had connected me with Rosalie Jenkins, an experienced consultant looking to partner with someone who understood emerging technologies. The night I left home for good came after my graduation ceremony. My parents had attended, of course. Appearances mattered, but remained unimpressed by my highest honors distinction or the entrepreneurship award I had received. At home, surrounded by packed boxes for my move to a small apartment, my father confronted me in the kitchen. "Your mother and I have discussed your situation," he began in his boardroom voice. "We think you're being impulsive. Eric Thompson's firm is still offering you that analyst position. It's entry-level, but it's a foot in the door." Eric Thompson was my mother's friend's husband. The position had been mentioned at a neighborhood function, a reluctant, vague offer made out of social obligation. "I've already committed to my clients," I replied, trying to stay calm. "And Rosalie and I have signed a partnership agreement. Breaking a commitment to these starter clients would be a valuable lesson in business reality," my mother added, entering the conversation. "Sometimes you need to disappoint small fish to catch bigger ones." That was when I realized nothing I achieved would ever be enough. No success would ever meet their standards because the standards themselves weren't real. They were moving targets designed to keep me seeking their approval. "I'm leaving tonight," I said quietly. "Not tomorrow." "Don't be dramatic," my father scoffed. "Running away because you can't handle a difficult conversation? This is exactly why we're concerned about your business venture." "I'm not running away," I said, finding a certainty in my voice that surprised even me. "I'm choosing a different path, one where success or failure will be on my own terms." "And when you fail?" my mother asked. When this consulting fantasy collapses, don't expect us to bail you out. I remember smiling then, not out of happiness, but from the sudden clarity of the moment. That's the difference between us. You see failure as inevitable. I see it as data. I left that night with my essential belongings, a business plan, and a determination to prove them wrong, not to them, but to myself. The 3 years that followed were challenging beyond anything I had anticipated. 16-hour workdays, clients who paid late or tried to expand scope without additional budget, technical problems that required all-night troubleshooting sessions, the constant hustle to find new business while delivering on existing commitments. But through it all, Crawford Consulting Solutions grew. Rosalie and I moved from her spare bedroom to a small office, then to our current downtown space with a team of 6 specialists. Our client list expanded from local businesses to regional companies, with our first national contract signed just last month. I had created something sustainable, something valuable, not because of my parents' support, but despite its absence. Before that video shattered my carefully constructed equilibrium, I had established a life that felt both successful and separate from my parents' influence. My typical day started at 5:30 a.m. with a run through the riverside park near my apartment, the discipline of physical exertion helping to center me before the day's challenges. By 7:00 a.m., I was at my desk in our downtown office, reviewing client deliverables and preparing for meetings before most of our team arrived. Rosalie often joked that I treated work-life balance as a theoretical concept that applied to everyone but me. There was some truth to that. Work wasn't just my profession. It had become my validation, my community, my purpose. You need to celebrate. Your wins more, Rosalie told me after we landed the national contract with Meridian Industries. She had arranged a small office party with champagne and catered food, but found me in my office still working on implementation timelines. I'm celebrating by making sure we execute perfectly, I replied, only half joking. The Vivian Crawford approach. Validate success by immediately moving the goalposts. She sat on the edge of my desk. You know who you sound like when you talk? That way? I knew exactly who she meant. Despite my best efforts, some of my parents' patterns had embedded themselves in my psyche. The difference was that I recognized them for what they were: fear responses, not wisdom. My apartment reflected this tension between achievement and restlessness. Minimal but expensive furnishings. Impressive view but barely used balcony. A beautiful kitchen where I rarely cooked elaborate meals because I was too busy working. A success story with the Hollow Center I refused to acknowledge. My personal life existed in carefully scheduled blocks between client meetings and project deadlines. Sunday brunches with Nicky, who had remained steadfastly loyal since childhood. Monthly dinners with Professor Winters, who had become something of a surrogate father figure. Occasional dates that rarely progressed beyond a third meeting because, as my last almost boyfriend had put it, you've built walls so high no one can see if there's anything worth climbing for. I had created a life that looked perfect from the outside: successful business, downtown apartment, financial independence, small circle of loyal friends. Yet underneath, there remained that familiar emptiness, the sense that it was all somehow provisional. That real fulfillment remained just out of reach. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had fled my parents' house to escape their impossible standards, only to impose equally demanding expectations on myself. My relationship with my parents had settled into a strained détente. Birthday texts, obligatory Christmas phone calls that never lasted more than 10 minutes. The occasional update when a mutual acquaintance married or died or had a child. Each interaction carefully choreographed to avoid any meaningful discussion of my business or their ongoing disappointment in my choices. 3 months ago, after our most recent stilted phone call, I had found myself staring at their contact information in my phone, wondering if reconciliation was even possible. In a moment of either weakness or hope, I'm still not sure which. I had sent them an email with a link to a business journal article featuring Crawford Consulting's innovative approach to ERP implementation for mid-market companies. The response? 2 days later was quintessentially them. Glad things are working out. Did you see that the Petersons' son just made partner at Goldman Sachs? I had laughed out loud at that. The perfect encapsulation of our dynamic. Any achievement of mine immediately countered with someone else's supposedly superior accomplishment. What I didn't know then was that while they were dismissing my professional success, their own financial situation was deteriorating. My father had been quietly struggling at work, his sales numbers declining as younger representatives with digital expertise gained market share. My mother's real estate business had never fully recovered from the market downturn 3 years prior. The forwarded emails from their mortgage company had started appearing in my old cloud account about 6 months ago. At first, they were just routine late payment notices, then payment plans, then warnings about potential foreclosure proceedings. Had debated reaching out directly, offering help, seeking reconciliation through this crisis. But every time I drafted the email or hovered my finger over their contact, I remembered the countless times they had weaponized any vulnerability I showed. Instead, I began researching their situation dispassionately, as I would a business case. Heartland Financial had overextended during the housing boom and was now aggressively offloading underperforming loans. My parents' mortgage was underwater. They owed more than the current market value of the house they had used for decades as their primary status symbol. When I approached Heartland about purchasing the debt, they were eager to deal with someone, offering cash without excessive negotiation. The process was straightforward, clinical, just numbers on paper, assets changing hands, or so I told myself. The truth was more complex. Some part of me had seen this as a path to resolution, a way to help them without subjecting myself to their judgment. Perhaps even a way to finally earn the recognition they had always withheld. What I hadn't anticipated was discovering through Nicky's video that nothing had changed. That even as their financial house of cards collapsed around them, they still found time to diminish me to anyone who would listen. So now I sat in my carefully constructed life, with its impressive view and hollow center, facing a decision that would irrevocably alter the status quo I had worked so hard to establish. The morning after watching Nicky's video, I woke before my alarm, my mind already racing with possibilities. Today, Heartland Financial would send official notification to my parents that their mortgage had been transferred to Crawford Holdings LLC, the shell company I had established specifically for this transaction. I moved through my morning routine, mechanically, run, shower, coffee, while mentally gaming out various scenarios. My training as a consultant had equipped me to analyze situations from multiple angles, to anticipate reactions and prepare contingencies. But this wasn't a business problem with logical parameters. This was personal, messy, emotional. As I dressed, for work, selecting a charcoal gray suit that always gave me confidence, my phone rang. It was Ron, my company's lead technical implementer. Morning, Vivian. Sorry to call so early, but the Meridian migration hit a snag overnight. Their legacy system is rejecting our data mapping protocols. Have you tried reconfiguring the API endpoints? I asked, slipping into problem-solving mode, temporarily grateful for the distraction. That's the first thing I checked. I think we need to go deeper, possibly rebuild the entire integration layer. I glanced at my watch. I'll be in the office in 30 minutes. Let's set up a war room and get this resolved before it impacts the timeline. Work had always been my refuge, the place where problems had solutions, where effort correlated directly with results. Today, however, the professional crisis couldn't fully displace the personal one looming in the background of my thoughts. After 4 intense hours resolving the Meridian issue, I retreated to my office and closed the door. I needed to make a decision about my next steps with my parents. The notification letter would be arriving today, possibly already sitting in their mailbox. I opened my laptop and navigated to the Crawford Holdings documentation. As the legal owner of their mortgage, I had several options. Do nothing. Continue accepting their payments, when they manage to make them, while remaining anonymous. Begin formal foreclosure proceedings, forcing them to face the consequences of their financial mismanagement. Offer them a modified payment plan with more favorable terms, still as an anonymous entity. Reveal myself as the mortgage holder and, what? Forgive the debt? Demand recognition? Force a reconciliation? None of these options felt right. Each was either too passive or too vindictive, too businesslike or too personal. My phone buzzed with a text from Nicky. They're posting on Facebook about financial persecution by some faceless corporation. Guess they got the letter. I closed. My eyes, imagining the scene at my childhood home. My father would be outraged, my mother devastated but primarily concerned with how this would appear to the neighbors. They would be casting themselves as victims of impersonal market forces, never considering how their own choices had contributed to their situation. Just as my parents had never considered how their constant criticism had affected me. That was the moment clarity began to emerge. This wasn't just about their mortgage or even their cruel words in the video. This was about a lifetime of conditional love, of moving goalposts, of never being enough. My office phone rang, Rosalie, calling, from her extension down the hall. Your 3 o'clock canceled, but I think you should keep the time blocked. You have that look today. What look? The I'm processing something major but pretending I'm fine look. Same one you had before we pitched Meridian, only more intense. I smiled despite myself. After 3 years as business partners, Rosalie could read me better than family ever had. My parents got the mortgage notification today. A pause. And nothing yet. I'm still deciding what to do next. Viv, Rosalie said carefully, I know you said this was a business decision, but we both know it wasn't. Not entirely. She was right, of course. The investment made financial sense, but I could have found dozens of other distressed properties to purchase. I had chosen their mortgage specifically because it gave me options, leverage, power in a relationship where I had always been powerless. I need to do something, I said finally. Staying anonymous feels cowardly. Foreclosing feels cruel. Revealing myself without a clear purpose feels pointless. Maybe the purpose isn't what you do with the mortgage, Rosalie suggested. Maybe it's what you say when they find out, the truth you've never been able to tell them. The truth. Such a simple concept, yet so elusive in my family. We had specialized in polite fictions, maintained appearances, buried uncomfortable realities, beneath layers of aspiration and pretense. After hanging up, I opened my desk drawer and removed a small leather journal, a gift from Professor Winters when I graduated. Inside, I had occasionally written letters to my parents that I never sent. Letters expressing disappointment, anger, hurt. Letters asking for understanding I never expected to receive. I flipped through pages of my undelivered truth, seeing patterns emerge. Not just pain, but longing. Not just anger, but unfulfilled hope for connection, for recognition, for the unconditional love other parents seem to offer freely. My computer chimed with an email notification. It was from the service provider handling the Crawford Holdings account, confirming that the notification had been delivered and providing a scan of the certified letter receipt, signed by my father's distinctive scrawl. It was done. The clock was now ticking. Soon they would start researching this mysterious Crawford Holdings LLC, trying to understand who now controlled their financial future. They might even make the connection to my business name, though I'd intentionally used a different registered address and agent for the holding company. I closed the journal and made my decision. This wouldn't be about revenge or validation or even reconciliation. This would be about truth, my truth, finally spoken without apology or expectation. I picked up my phone and, for the first time in 3 years, dialed my parents' number directly instead of texting. It was time to break the stalemate, to stop reacting to their narrative and create my own. As the phone rang, I felt a strange calm replace the turmoil that had churned inside me since receiving Nicky's video. Whatever happened next, I would be acting from authenticity rather than old patterns of seeking approval or avoiding criticism. The line connected. My mother's voice answered, tense and distracted. Lorna Crawford speaking. "Mom," I said evenly. "It's Vivian. We need to talk." "Vivian?" My mother's voice shifted from professional to surprised. "This is unexpected." In the background, I could hear my father asking who was calling. My mother's muffled response, then his voice growing louder as he approached. "Is that her?" "Give me the phone." A shuffling sound, then my father's voice. "Vivian, interesting timing." His tone carried the familiar edge of suspicion that had colored so many of our interactions. Even now, reaching out after months of minimal contact was viewed not as an olive branch but as potentially having an ulterior motive. "I heard you've been having some financial difficulties," I said, keeping my voice neutral. A sharp intake of breath. "Who told you that? Nicky Lambert? That girl always was a gossip, course that would be his focus, who had betrayed them by revealing their struggles, not the struggles themselves." "That's not important," I replied. "What matters is that I might be in a position to help." "Help?" My father's laugh was brittle. "Since when has the great independent Vivian offered help to anyone? Besides, we're handling it. Just a temporary cash flow issue." In the background, my mother's voice. "Harry, don't. At least hear what she's saying." Even now, they couldn't be straight with me. Their house was underwater. They were months behind on payments. And yet my father's pride wouldn't allow him to acknowledge reality. "I'd like to meet with you both," I said. "Tomorrow evening, if possible. We're rather busy dealing with this mortgage situation." "That's exactly what I want to discuss," I interrupted. 7 p.m. I'll come to the house." Before he could object further, I ended the call. My heart was pounding, but not from anxiety, from a strange, unexpected sense of power. Not the petty power of having financial leverage over them, but something deeper. The power of finally setting the terms of our interaction rather than reacting to theirs. Rosalie appeared in my office doorway. "From your expression, I'm guessing you've made a decision." I nodded. "I'm meeting them tomorrow night." "Want me to be your backup? I could call with a fake emergency if things get rough." I smiled at her loyalty. "I appreciate that, but this is something I need to handle myself." The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and client calls. Outwardly, I maintained my usual professional demeanor. Inwardly, I was preparing for what might be the most important presentation of my life. That evening, instead of working late as usual, I left the office at a reasonable hour and drove to the one place where I had always found clarity. Riverside Park, where Professor Winters and I had our regular mentoring walks during my college years. The sun was setting over the water as I found our usual bench. I sat down, watching the golden light play across the ripples, and pulled out my phone. "Is this a good time?" I asked when he answered. "For you?" "Always." Professor Winters's voice carried the same warmth and steadiness that had anchored me through my most difficult academic and early professional challenges. I explained the situation, my parents' financial troubles, my purchase of their mortgage, the video, my planned confrontation. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "May I make an observation, Vivian?" "Of course. You've spent your life trying to prove your worth to people who, for their own reasons, cannot or will not acknowledge it. Perhaps this situation isn't about proving anything to them, but about recognizing what you've proven to yourself." I considered this, watching a pair of ducks glide across the water. "What do you mean exactly?" Think about everything you've built, not just your business, but your independence, your resilience, your ability to succeed where they predicted failure. Those achievements exist regardless of their recognition. So you think I shouldn't confront them? On the contrary, I think you should approach this meeting not as their daughter seeking validation, but as the accomplished woman you've become, offering them a business arrangement with clear terms, both financial and emotional. Something shifted in my perspective. All these years, I had been seeing myself through the distorted lens they had created, as somehow perpetually inadequate despite evidence to the contrary. What if I approached this situation from my actual position of strength? They don't actually know who I am, I said slowly. They know who I was, or rather who they thought I was, but they have no real concept of who I've become. Precisely, Professor Winters replied. And therein lies your hidden advantage. They'll be expecting the Vivian who left their house 3 years ago, defensive, reactive, seeking approval, not the confident business owner who now holds the deed to their home. After our call, I sat by the river until darkness fell, mental pieces clicking into place like the complex systems I designed for clients. I had been approaching this all wrong, viewing it as a personal confrontation when it was actually a negotiation. My parents had spent a lifetime controlling the narrative of who I was. Tomorrow, I would show them the reality they had refused to see. Back at my apartment, I pulled out my laptop and began constructing a presentation, not unlike those I created, for major clients but far more personal. I outlined my company's growth trajectory, key achievements, financial position. I detailed the circumstances of acquiring their mortgage and the options now available. But most importantly, I documented the pattern of our relationship, specific instances of undermining, dismissal, and emotional manipulation that had defined my upbringing, not as accusations, but as data points establishing a pattern that needed to be acknowledged before any path forward could be discussed. By midnight, I had created something unprecedented in our family history, an honest assessment of where we stood and how we had arrived there. As I prepared for bed, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror and paused. Something had changed in my expression, a certainty, a groundedness I hadn't seen before. For the first time, I was approaching my parents not from a position of seeking approval or defending my choices, but from a place of clear-eyed evaluation of what was and wasn't acceptable in my life. I slept more soundly that night than I had in months. The next morning, I forwarded my presentation to Rosalie with a note. Not for review, just for safekeeping. This is what I'll be presenting tonight. Her response came minutes later. This is the most brilliantly ruthless thing I've ever seen, and by ruthless, I mean honest. They won't know what hit them. She was right. My parents had never encountered the full extent of my capabilities, my analytical thinking, my strategic planning, my ability to dismantle complex problems and rebuild them into workable solutions. They had seen only what they expected to see, a daughter who didn't quite measure up. Tonight, they would meet the woman who had built a thriving business from nothing, who had earned the respect of industry peers and the loyalty of demanding clients who had learned to recognize value where others saw only cost. They would meet Vivian Crawford, CEO, the person I had become while they weren't watching. At precisely 6:55 p.m., I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the once impressive colonial now showing signs of deferred maintenance. The painted shutters were peeling, the landscaping overgrown, in places. Small details my appearance-conscious parents would never have allowed to slide in better times. I sat in my car for a moment, centering myself. In the passenger seat lay my laptop and a folder containing printed copies of key documents: the mortgage transfer, payment history, current property valuation, and options moving forward. Everything organized with the same meticulous attention I brought to client presentations. This was business, I reminded myself. Complicated by emotion, certainly, but fundamentally a transaction that needed clear terms and boundaries. At 7 p.m. exactly, I stepped onto the porch and rang the doorbell. The familiar chime brought an unexpected wave of memories, rushing down the stairs as a child, excited for a friend's visit, nervously waiting for prom dates under my father's watchful glare, leaving for college with a mixture of trepidation and relief. My mother opened the door, her smile tight and uncertain. She had dressed carefully. I recognized the strategy of armor through appearance. "Vivian, you look professional." From her tone, I couldn't tell if this was a compliment or criticism. Classic Lorna Crawford ambiguity. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," I replied, stepping past her into the foyer. My father waited in the living room, standing rather than sitting, maintaining the higher ground. Even in crisis, positioning was everything to Harry Crawford. "Let's get to the point," he said without greeting. "You mentioned our financial difficulties. What exactly do you think you know, and what exactly do you think you can do about it?" Direct, borderline hostile. Exactly as I had anticipated. I placed my laptop and folder on the coffee table and took a seat on the sofa, deliberately choosing not to engage with his confrontational tone. "I know that you're 4 months behind on your mortgage payments. I know that Heartland Financial was preparing to begin foreclosure proceedings. And I know that as of yesterday, your mortgage is now held by Crawford Holdings, LLC. My mother sank into an armchair, her facade cracking slightly. "How do you know all this? Have you been spying on us? You never updated the email address on your Heartland account. The notifications were being forwarded to our old shared cloud storage." My father remained standing, his expression darkening. "And you've been reading our private financial communications? That's an oversight on your part," I interrupted calmly. "But that's not why I'm here." "Then why are you here?" my mother asked. "To gloat? To tell us you told us so?" I opened my laptop, ignoring the accusation. "I'm here because I'm in a position to help, and despite everything, I don't want to see you lose your home." My father scoffed. "Help? What kind of help could you possibly?" "I own your mortgage." The words landed like stones in still water, creating expanding ripples of silence. My father froze mid-sentence. My mother's hand flew to her throat. "What did you just say?" My father's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Crawford Holdings, LLC. I established it specifically to purchase your distressed mortgage from Heartland Financial." I turned the laptop toward them, showing the documentation. "I am now, legally and financially, your mortgage holder." My mother looked to my father, her expression panicked. My father's face flushed deep red. This is absurd. Impossible. You couldn't possibly have the resources to purchase a single distressed mortgage at 60 cents on the dollar? Actually, I could. My company has been quite successful. I kept my voice even, factual. More successful than you know, because you've never actually asked. My father began pacing, processing this information against his established worldview, where his daughter was perpetually inadequate. The cognitive dissonance was visible in his expression. Why? My mother's question was barely audible. "Why would you do this?" This was the catalyst moment, the point where pretense fell away and truth emerged. I had rehearsed various answers to this question, ranging from businesslike to emotional. But sitting here now, facing their confusion and disbelief, only the most honest response felt right. Initially, it was a business decision. Distressed debt can be a sound investment when purchased correctly. I paused, then continued more quietly. But I could have bought any mortgage. I chose yours because I thought it might finally create a bridge between us. A way to help without subjecting myself to the judgment that has defined our relationship. Judgment? My father stopped pacing. "We've only ever wanted what's best for you." And there it was. The fundamental disconnect. the gap between their perception and reality that had shaped our family dynamic for decades. "No," I said firmly. "You've wanted what you think should be best for me. There's a difference." I opened the folder and removed a printout, the screenshot of my father's words from Nicky's video, with a transcript beneath. "Yesterday, I received this. A video of you, Dad, at the neighborhood barbecue, telling everyone I'm worthless and that cutting me off was the best decision you ever made." I placed it on the coffee table between us. My mother glanced at it and quickly looked away. My father didn't move. "The same day that video was taken," I continued, "I was finalizing paperwork to purchase your mortgage, to help you keep your home. The same day you were disparaging me to the neighbors, I was trying to find a way to support you without compromising my own boundaries." The silence that followed was profound, heavy with decades of misunderstanding and hurt. "You've spent my entire life telling me, directly and indirectly, that I wasn't enough, that my choices were wrong, my achievements inadequate, my path misguided." I gestured to the mortgage documents on my laptop screen. "But it turns out, I'm not the one who failed. I built something sustainable while you were creating an illusion you couldn't maintain." My mother started to cry silently. My father remained frozen, his worldview visibly collapsing around him. "So here we are," I said, closing the folder. "I own your mortgage. I can foreclose tomorrow, modify the terms, or forgive it entirely. The choice is mine." I stood, gathering my belongings. "I'll give you until tomorrow to process this. Then, we can discuss options moving forward, both financial and personal." As I walked toward the door, my father finally spoke. "Vivian, wait. You can't just drop this on us and leave. We need to—" I turned back, meeting his gaze directly. "For once in our relationship, Dad, we're going to do things on my timeline, not yours. I'll return tomorrow at 7 p.m. Be prepared to have an honest conversation, probably for the first time in our family history." And with that, I walked out the door, leaving behind the stunned silence of a family paradigm shattered beyond repair. Driving away from my parents' house, I felt oddly weightless. The confrontation I had feared for so long was finally behind me. Not the full reckoning yet, but the first honest words exchanged in perhaps our entire relationship. Instead of heading home, I found myself driving to Clearwater Point, a scenic overlook above the city where I had often retreated during high school, when my parents' expectations became too suffocating. The spot where I had first dreamed of building a different kind of life. The night was clear, the city lights below mirroring the stars above. I sat on the hood of my car, breathing in the cool air, allowing myself to feel the full impact of what had just transpired. My phone buzzed repeatedly, texts from both parents, separately trying to regain control of the situation. I silenced it without reading them. For once, they would have to wait for me, sitting with the uncomfortable reality I had presented. What had I actually accomplished tonight? I had surprised them, certainly, shocked them with evidence of my success and their vulnerability. But had I changed anything fundamental? Would this lead to the honest relationship I had always craved, or simply create a new battlefield for old conflicts? I pulled out the journal Professor Winters had given me and began writing, not a letter to my parents this time, but to myself, an honest assessment of what I truly wanted from this situation. I don't want revenge. Revenge would make me more like them, not less. I don't want them to suffer. Their suffering won't heal my wounds. I don't want to control them the way they tried to control me. Control isn't connection. What I want is recognition, not of my success, but of my reality. The acknowledgement that their narrative about me was never accurate. That the daughter they dismissed as worthless never actually existed, except in their own limited perception. What I want is for them to see me, truly see me, perhaps for the first time. And if that's not possible, what I want is the peace of finally accepting that limitation and moving forward anyway. As I wrote these words, I realized something profound. The power I felt wasn't from owning their mortgage or holding their financial future in my hands. It came from finally owning my truth and speaking it aloud without apology or expectation. For years, I had built my life in opposition to theirs, working to prove them wrong, to demonstrate my worth through achievement. But in doing so, I had inadvertently kept them at the center of my story. My success, however genuine, was still partly defined by their doubt. Tonight had changed that equation, not because I had gained power over them, but because I had reclaimed power over my own narrative. My phone rang, interrupting my reflection. "Rosalie." "Hey," I answered, my voice sounding distant even to myself. "Just checking you're still alive after the Crawford family showdown." I smiled despite myself. Physically intact, emotionally processing. How bad was it? Exactly as expected and completely surprising at the same time. I described their reactions, the shock on their faces when I revealed my ownership of their mortgage, the familiar patterns of deflection and denial. "So what happens tomorrow?" Rosalie asked when I finished. "I don't know yet." I looked out over the city lights, thinking, they'll try to regain control, either through anger, manipulation, or perhaps even a sudden show of approval now that they know I'm successful. And what will you do? Hold the line, insist on honesty, and decide what kind of relationship is actually possible with people who may fundamentally be incapable of seeing me clearly. Rosalie was quiet for a moment. "You know, when we started Crawford Consulting, I thought the name was just good branding, leveraging your family name for business credibility. I didn't realize it was actually an act of reclamation." I had never thought of it that way, but she was right. Taking the Crawford name for my company had been my first step toward defining it on my own terms, separate from my parents' legacy. After we hung up, I sat for a while longer, watching planes descend toward the airport, their lights tracing gentle arcs through the darkness. Each one carrying people returning home or venturing toward something new. My thoughts turned to the practicalities ahead. What terms would I offer my parents? What boundaries would I establish? How would I respond if they refused accountability or twisted this situation into yet another narrative where they were victims of an ungrateful daughter? The mortgage gave me leverage, but leveraging it punitively would make me precisely what? They had always accused me of being selfish, uncaring, focused only on my own interests. Yet simply forgiving it without addressing the underlying patterns would enable continued dysfunction. There needed to be a middle path, one that offered genuine help while establishing clear boundaries and expectations for any future relationship. Remembered something Professor Winters had told me during my first year of graduate school, when I was struggling with a particularly complex system design. The elegance of a solution isn't in how complicated you can make it, but in finding the simplest path that addresses all essential requirements. What were the essential requirements here? Financial stability for my parents, accountability for past behaviors, a framework for healthier interaction moving forward if possible, and most importantly, my own peace regardless of their response. By the time I drove home, a plan had formed, not elaborate or punitive, but clear and direct. Terms that reflected both compassion and self-respect. In my apartment, I drafted a modification agreement for their mortgage, reasonable payments, favorable interest, no penalties for the existing delinquency. Fair terms that acknowledged family, ties without creating unhealthy dependency. Then I wrote a second document, one outlining personal boundaries and expectations for any ongoing relationship. Respect for my choices, no public or private disparagement, acknowledgement of past patterns, and commitment to changed behavior. The mortgage modification would be contingent on adherence to these personal terms, not as punishment, but as recognition that financial and emotional transactions between us were inherently connected. They might refuse. They might accuse me of extortion or cruelty. They might choose to lose their home rather than acknowledge the reality of our dysfunctional dynamic. But for the first time, their reaction wouldn't define my worth or determine my path forward. I had created options for reconciliation while preparing myself for the possibility that true reconciliation might not be possible. As I finally went to bed, I felt neither triumphant nor anxious. Instead, I experienced something rarer and more valuable, the quiet certainty of standing in my own truth, regardless of whether others chose to see it. The next morning, I woke with unusual clarity. Typically, my mind would immediately race to client deliverables, project timelines, and meetings scheduled for the day. Today, all of that seemed secondary to the task ahead. I had made my move. Tonight would determine where the pieces would fall. At the office, I maintained my usual focused demeanor, though Rosalie noticed the difference immediately. "You seem lighter," she observed as we reviewed the Meridian implementation plan. "Like something's been resolved." "Not resolved," I clarified, "but clarified. I know what I want from this situation now, regardless of how they respond." "And what's that?" "My own peace. On my own terms." She smiled. "That might be the most ambitious goal you've ever set." By afternoon, the text messages from my parents had evolved from demanding immediate contact to offering to discuss things reasonably. My father had called twice, leaving carefully worded voicemails that walked the line between apology and justification. My mother had sent an email with the subject line, "Families should support each other," without acknowledging the irony of that statement given their history. I responded to none of them, letting the boundary I had established stand firm. 7 p.m. On my terms. At 5:30, I left the office and drove home to change. For last night's confrontation, I had deliberately worn business attire, armor of a sort, and a visual reminder of my professional success. Tonight required something different. I chose clothes that were still polished but less formal, an outfit that represented the authentic self I had built, not the corporate persona or the diminished daughter. Before leaving, I checked my preparation. Once more. The mortgage modification agreement, printed and ready. The document outlining personal boundaries and expectations. A third item I had added this morning, a USB drive containing video compilations of family events over the years, edited to highlight patterns of interaction I had normalized but now recognized as harmful. I wasn't interested in simply making them feel bad about the past. I wanted them to see it clearly, perhaps for the first time. At 6:55, I pulled into their driveway again. This time, the porch light was on. The front door opened before I could ring the bell. My mother waiting anxiously, my father visible in the living room beyond. "Vivian," my mother began immediately, her voice striving for warmth. "We're so glad you're here. We've been thinking about everything you said and—" "Let's sit down first," I interjected calmly, moving past her into the house. The living room had been tidied since yesterday. Family photos were prominently displayed, including several featuring me that hadn't been visible before. A transparent attempt at revisionist history. My father stood as I entered, his demeanor markedly different from yesterday's hostility. "Vivian, thank you for coming back. We clearly have a lot to discuss." I nodded and took the same seat I had occupied yesterday. "We do." "Before we start," my mother said, perching on the edge of the sofa, "we want you to know how proud we are of what you've accomplished. Your father looked up your company online, and what you've built is truly impressive." And there it was, the sudden approval now that my success had been forcibly brought to their attention. The validation that had been withheld when I needed, at most, now offered when it served their interests. "Thank you," I said simply, not rejecting the compliment, but not embracing it either. "But my professional success isn't why I'm here." My father cleared his throat. About the mortgage situation. The mortgage is a symptom, not the problem, I interrupted. Before we discuss financial arrangements, we need to address the underlying patterns that brought us to this point. Patterns? My mother's forehead creased in confusion that seemed genuine. What patterns? Rather than answering directly, I removed the USB drive from my bag and handed it to my father. I'd like you to connect this to the TV. There's something I need you both to see. He hesitated, then complied, turning on the large television that had been the centerpiece of so many family nights I now recognized had been filled with subtle undermining and criticism, disguised as concern. The video began with footage from my high school graduation. My valedictorian speech met with muted approval from my parents while they lavished praise on the salutatorian. She balanced academics with so many extracurriculars, Harry. That shows real character. Then my college graduation, my father's. Voiceover dinner afterward. The program seemed rather basic compared to what Jennifer's son is doing at Princeton. My first business award. My mother's response, "It's nice, dear, but these industry things give out so many awards these days. Everyone gets something." Moment after moment, year after year, a steady stream of diminishment that had shaped my self-perception in ways I was only now fully recognizing. As the montage continued, my parents grew increasingly uncomfortable. My mother's hand covered her mouth. My father's jaw tightened. "This is selective editing," he finally said, reaching for the remote. "You've taken things out of context." I gently placed my hand over his, stopping him. There's context for criticism that makes it constructive. There's no context for chronic undermining that makes it healthy. When the video ended, concluding with the clip from Nicky showing their most recent disparagement, silence filled the room. "I didn't come here to make you feel attacked," I said quietly. "I came because I believe clarity is necessary for any path forward." "What do you want from us, Vivian?" My mother's voice wavered. "To say we were terrible parents? That we ruined your life?" "No, my life isn't ruined. Far from it. What I want is acknowledgement of the reality of our relationship. Not your intentions, which I'm sure you believe were good, but the impact of your words and actions." My father stood suddenly, pacing as he had yesterday, but with less anger and more agitation. "We pushed you because we wanted you to succeed. We were harder on you because we knew you had potential." "That explanation might feel comforting," I replied, "but it doesn't address the pattern. The criticism didn't stop when I succeeded. It simply shifted to new targets. The goalposts moved constantly because the purpose wasn't motivation. It was control." He stopped pacing, staring at me as if seeing someone unfamiliar. "You really believe that?" "I know it. And deep down, I think you do too." My mother wiped tears from her cheeks. "What happens now? With the house? With everything?" I opened my bag and removed the 2 documents I had prepared. "I've drafted a mortgage modification with terms that will allow you to keep your home while maintaining reasonable payments based on your current financial situation." I placed it on the coffee table, then set the second document beside it. "I've also outlined my expectations for any continued relationship between us. Respect for boundaries. No public or private disparagement. Acknowledgement of past patterns and commitment to change. You're conditioning financial help on how we behave?" My father's voice held disbelief. "I'm recognizing that financial and personal relationships are connected," I corrected. "And I'm being explicit about terms rather than allowing unhealthy, implicit expectations to continue." My parents stared at the documents before them, the mortgage modification agreement and the personal boundaries contract, 2 pieces of paper representing a complete restructuring of our family dynamic. "Take time to review everything," I said, standing up. "I don't expect an immediate decision." "You're leaving?" My mother looked alarmed. "But we haven't resolved anything." "Resolution doesn't happen in a single conversation," I replied, especially when the patterns we're addressing have developed over decades. My father picked up the personal boundaries document, scanning it with the same expression he used to review my school essays, looking for flaws, for weaknesses, for places to insert control. Some of these terms seem excessive, he said, his tone careful. For instance, this requirement that any critical feedback must be specifically requested. That's because unsolicited criticism has been your primary mode of interaction with me for my entire life, I explained evenly. If we're going to build a healthier relationship, that pattern needs to change fundamentally. He frowned. And if we find these personal terms unacceptable? This was the moment of truth, the line I had decided I would not cross. Then I'll still offer reasonable mortgage terms because I don't believe in financial coercion. But our personal relationship will remain limited or non-existent, depending on your behavior moving forward. My mother gasped softly. You'd cut us off completely? I already did, 3 years ago. I reminded her gently. I'm now offering a potential path back to connection, but only under conditions that protect my well-being. I moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. I've scheduled a meeting with a family therapist who specializes in adult parent-child relationships. The appointment is for next Tuesday at 6 p.m., if you're interested in attending. It's optional, but recommended if you want to move forward with rebuilding our relationship. My father's expression tightened. We don't need a stranger telling us how to interact with our own daughter. That reaction, I said quietly, is precisely why we might benefit from professional guidance. I left them with the documents, the video evidence of our dysfunctional patterns, and a choice to make. As I drove away, I felt neither triumph nor anxiety, just the calm certainty that I had finally taken control of my own narrative. Back at my apartment, I poured a glass of wine and settled onto my balcony, looking out at the city lights. For the first time in years, I had spoken my truth to my parents without filtering it through fear of their response. Whether they could hear it, whether they could change, remained to be seen. But my peace no longer depended on their validation. My phone buzzed with a text from Nicky. How did it go? I typed back, honestly, better than expected. Not because they responded perfectly, but because I remained true to myself throughout. A moment later, she replied, That's the Vivian I always knew was in there, the one who showed up when your parents weren't watching. Her words struck a chord. So much of my authentic self had developed in spaces where my parents' critical gaze couldn't reach. With friends like Nicky, with mentors like Professor Winters in the business I had built with Rosalie. I had compartmentalized my life, showing different facets in different contexts. Tonight had been the first time I had brought my whole self into my parents' house. Neither the defensive daughter nor the aggressive adversary they might have expected, but the centered, boundary-setting adult I had become. My strategy moving forward was clear. Maintain these boundaries regardless of their response. If they chose to engage constructively, our relationship had the potential to heal and transform. If they refused, I would accept that limitation without allowing it to diminish my sense of self-worth. The following morning, I gave Rosalie a brief update as we prepared for a client meeting. So basically, you've given them a choice between having a real relationship with you or continuing their fantasy where you're the perpetually inadequate daughter, she summarized. Essentially, yes, though I suspect they don't see it that way. Yet. They probably view it as me using financial leverage to control them, projecting their own tactics onto my actions. Rosalie considered this. And if they reject your terms, both personal and financial? Then Crawford Holdings begins standard foreclosure proceedings, and I remove myself from the equation personally. Their mortgage becomes a straightforward business matter handled through appropriate legal channels. Could you really do that? Let them lose their home? I paused, considering. I wouldn't be letting them lose anything. They would be choosing a negative financial outcome over addressing toxic relational patterns. There's a difference. That's remarkably clear-eyed. It has to be, I replied. Otherwise, I'm right back in the old dynamic, taking responsibility for their choices, adjusting my behavior to manage their emotions, perpetuating unhealthy patterns. Throughout the day, I maintained focus on work while remaining aware that my parents were likely discussing, debating, and possibly seeking outside perspectives on my proposal. My father might consult attorney friends about the legality of connecting financial terms to personal behavior. My mother might reach out to her social circle for sympathy about her ungrateful daughter. But for once, their reactions, their spin on the situation, didn't dominate my thoughts. I had presented my truth clearly and established my boundaries, firmly. The next move was theirs, but the outcome would not define me either way. That evening, I met Professor Winters for our monthly dinner. Over pasta at our usual restaurant, I shared the developments with my parents. "I'm curious," he said after I explained the documents I had presented them. "Why did you choose to include the video compilation? That seems more confrontational than your usual approach. Because words alone haven't worked. They've spent years rewriting history, convincing themselves their criticism was constructive, their undermining was motivation. They needed to see the pattern played back to them without the filter of their good intentions." He nodded thoughtfully. "And you're prepared for the possibility that even with evidence, they might not acknowledge the reality of your experience?" "I am," I said, surprised by how true it felt. Their validation isn't necessary for my truth to be valid. It took me years to understand that. "That," he said with a gentle smile, "is perhaps the most important boundary you've established." As we finished dinner, my phone buzzed with a text message from my father. "We've reviewed your documents. We'd like to meet again tomorrow evening to discuss. We'll have our response ready." The message was terse, non-committal, revealing nothing about their decision or state of mind. The old me would have spent hours analyzing the wording, the timing, the implications. The new me simply replied, 7 p.m. works for me. See you then." I shared the update with Professor Winters, who asked, "What outcome are you hoping for?" I considered the question carefully. "I'm hoping for acknowledgement. Not necessarily agreement with every point, but recognition that my experience of our relationship is real and valid. Beyond that, I'm genuinely open to whatever unfolds." As I drove home later, I realized the truth of my words. For perhaps the first time regarding my parents, I was approaching the situation without a desperate need for specific validation or approval. I had found the validation I needed within myself, through the life I had built and the relationships I had cultivated with people who saw my authentic worth. Whatever response my parents offered tomorrow, acceptance, rejection, or something in between, would not shake the foundation I had established. The strategy had shifted from seeking external validation to maintaining internal clarity, from changing them to anchoring myself. The freedom in that realization was profound. The next day passed with unusual tranquility, despite the looming meeting with my parents. I moved through client calls and team discussions with focused presence, compartmentalizing the personal situation in a way I never could have managed 3 years ago. At lunch, Rosalie joined me at my desk with takeout containers. "So, tonight's the verdict?" I nodded, opening the salad she'd brought me. "Though I'm trying not to frame it that way, it's not about winning or losing. Still, you must have some expectation of how they'll respond." I considered this. Based on pattern recognition, they'll try to find a middle ground that acknowledges just enough to satisfy me while preserving their self-image. They'll accept the financial terms because they need to, and they'll negotiate on the personal terms, testing which boundaries they can erode. "Sounds like a client trying to scope creep a project," Rosalie observed. I laughed. "The parallels are unsettlingly accurate." As we ate, Rosalie tilted her head thoughtfully. You know, when you first told me about purchasing their mortgage, I was concerned. It seemed like a high-risk move, emotionally speaking. But watching how you've handled this, the clarity, the boundaries, I'm impressed. This isn't about revenge at all, is it? It never was, I admitted. Though I can't claim I knew exactly what it was about when I started. I just knew I needed to change the dynamic somehow. After lunch, I received an unexpected call from Nita, my parents' next-door neighbor. We had been close when I was growing up. She had been something of a surrogate aunt, providing the unconditional support my parents never could. "Vivian, honey," she began after pleasantries, "I hope you don't mind me calling. Your mother stopped by this morning, quite upset." I tensed slightly. "What did she tell you?" "Bits and pieces, something about you being involved with their mortgage situation. But I've known your mother long enough to recognize when I'm getting a carefully edited version of events." I hesitated, unsure how much to share. "You don't have to tell me details," Nita continued, sensing my reluctance. "I just wanted you to know that whatever's happening, I'm in your corner. Always have been." The simple validation in her words brought unexpected emotion to my throat. "Thank you, Nita. That means more than you know right now." "Your parents," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "They love you in their way, but they've never really seen you clearly. Too busy projecting what they thought you should be." "You noticed that?" I asked, surprised by her perception. "Honey, everyone noticed. We just didn't know how to help. You can't tell parents how to parent without making more problems sometimes." After we hung up, I sat with the realization that the dynamic I had normalized had been visible to others all along. The isolation I had felt wasn't as complete as I had believed. There had been witnesses to my experience, people who had seen the reality my parents denied. This knowledge strengthened my resolve for the evening ahead. I wasn't creating a new narrative. I was finally acknowledging one that had existed all along, just beneath the surface of polite interactions and social pretense. Later that afternoon, Professor Winters sent a text. "Remember, acknowledgement of your reality doesn't require them to abandon theirs entirely. Look for bridges, not conversions." His wisdom, as always, provided valuable perspective. I wasn't trying to force my parents to completely rewrite their understanding of our family history overnight. I was asking for space for my experience to exist alongside theirs, for recognition that their intentions didn't negate my lived reality. As 7 p.m. approached, I drove to my parents' house with a sense of calm purpose. Whatever happened tonight would not be the end of the story, merely another chapter in a complex relationship. The difference was that I was now co-authoring the narrative rather than being written as a secondary character in their version. When I arrived, I was surprised to find a third car in the driveway, one I recognized as belonging to Uncle Moses, my father's younger brother. My relationship with Moses had always been warmer than with my parents. He had a gentleness my father lacked, a willingness to listen rather than direct. My mother opened the door before I could knock, her expression a careful mask of neutrality. "Vivian, your Uncle Moses is here. We hope you don't mind, but we wanted some family support during this discussion." The old me would have felt ambushed, outnumbered. The new me recognized this for what it was: my parents seeking an ally, someone to mediate or perhaps validate their perspective. "Of course," I said calmly. "It's good to see family taking support seriously." In the living room, Moses stood to embrace me warmly. "Vivian, you're looking well." "Thanks, Uncle Moses. I appreciate you being here." And I meant it. Unlike my parents, Moses had always shown genuine interest in my life and choices, free from the constant evaluation that characterized my parents' attention. My father sat rigidly, in his usual chair, a folder on his lap, their response to my documents, no doubt carefully prepared and reviewed. "Shall we begin?" I suggested, taking the same seat I had occupied during our previous meetings. The position felt significant somehow. each time returning to the same physical space while occupying an increasingly different emotional one. My father cleared his throat. Before we discuss your proposals, there's something we'd like to say. He glanced at my mother, who nodded encouragingly. We've spent considerable time reviewing the video you showed us, as well as reflecting on our relationship more broadly. I remained silent, waiting. While we don't agree with your characterization of our intentions, he continued carefully, we can acknowledge that some of our methods of encouragement may have been experienced by you as criticism. It was a careful statement, crafted to offer minimal concession while preserving their narrative of good intentions. Classic Harry Crawford negotiation strategy. Give a little to protect the core position. We were surprised, my mother added, her voice wavering slightly, to see those moments compiled that way. Individual instances that seemed insignificant at the time appear different when viewed collectively. I nodded, acknowledging their effort without immediately accepting it as sufficient. Thank you for taking the time to review the evidence. Recognition of impact, regardless of intention, is an important first step. My father opened the folder on his lap. Regarding your proposed terms, we've prepared a response that we believe addresses your concerns while maintaining reasonable parameters for all parties. As he began to detail their counteroffer, I caught Uncle Moses watching me with an expression of quiet pride. He gave me a subtle nod, recognition of the strength it had taken to initiate this conversation, to establish these boundaries with parents who had always defined the terms of our relationship. In that moment, I realized something important. While my parents had been the central figures in my narrative of family dysfunction, I had allies I hadn't fully recognized. People like Nita, Moses, Professor Winters, Rosalie, and Nicky, who had seen my value clearly even when my parents couldn't. Their validation had sustained me through years of parental criticism, providing alternate perspectives that had allowed me to develop a healthier sense of self. This confrontation with my parents wasn't happening in isolation. It was supported by a network of relationships based on mutual respect and genuine connection, the very qualities that had been missing from my relationship with my parents. Whatever happened next, I wasn't alone in this journey. My father's counterproposal was exactly what I had anticipated, accepting most of the financial terms while attempting to soften the personal boundaries. He had restructured my clear requirements into vaguer, mutual commitments to improved communication, diluting specific prohibitions against criticism into aspirational goals for more constructive feedback. We feel these adjustments create a more balanced framework, he concluded, handing me their document. One that acknowledges your concerns while recognizing that relationships require flexibility from all parties. I took a moment to review their revisions, aware of all three of them watching me intently. The financial acceptance was expected. They had few alternatives given their situation. The pushback on personal boundaries was equally predictable. I appreciate your thoughtful response, I said finally, setting the document on the coffee table. There are elements here we can work with, and others that will need further discussion. My mother leaned forward eagerly. So you're open to our suggestions? I'm open to dialogue, I clarified. But I want to be very clear about something fundamental. The personal boundaries I've outlined aren't negotiable in principle, only in implementation details. My father's expression tightened. That's a rather rigid position, Vivian. It's a necessary one, I countered calmly. Boundaries aren't punishments or controls. They're the basic requirements for my well-being in this relationship. Uncle Moses spoke for the first time since the discussion began. Harry, Lorna, I think what Vivian is saying makes sense. She's not asking you to be perfect. She's asking for acknowledgement of past patterns and commitment to different ones moving forward. My father turned to him with a hint of betrayal. We thought you were here to help mediate a reasonable solution. I am, Moses replied steadily. But reasonable doesn't always mean compromise. especially when the starting positions aren't equally valid. From what I've seen tonight and what I've observed over the years, Vivian's boundaries seem both clear and fair. The support from Moses shifted the energy in the room. My parents had clearly expected him to naturally align with their perspective, to help persuade me toward greater flexibility. Perhaps, I suggested, we should focus on understanding before negotiating. Can you tell me which specific boundaries you find problematic and why? My mother glanced at my father before responding. Well, for instance, this requirement that we can't offer any guidance unless explicitly asked. Parents naturally want to help their children make good choices. I'm 31 years old, I reminded her gently. I have a successful business, financial stability, and a track record of sound decision-making. Your guidance at this point isn't a parental necessity. It's a choice about how you want to interact with me. And this stipulation about public statements, my father added. It seems excessive to require only positive or neutral comments about you to others. Is it? I asked simply. Is it truly excessive to ask that my parents not disparage me to neighbors, friends, and family? When framed that way, he had no ready response. Uncle Moses leaned forward. Harry, Lorna, may I suggest something? Instead of approaching this as a negotiation where you're trying to preserve as much of your usual behavior as possible, try thinking of it as an opportunity to build a new relationship with your daughter, one based on who she is now, not who you've always assumed she should be. The wisdom in his words hung in the air between us. We need time to process all this, my mother said finally. It's a lot to take in. I nodded. I understand. Why don't we pause the discussion of personal boundaries for now and focus on finalizing the mortgage modification? We can address the relationship parameters at the therapy appointment I mentioned, if you're willing to attend. My father frowned. You're still insisting on that? I'm not insisting, I corrected. I'm strongly recommending it as the most constructive path forward. Having a neutral third party facilitate these discussions would benefit all of us. After some further negotiation on interest rates and payment terms, we reached agreement on the financial aspects. My parents would keep their home with manageable payments, and I would have a reasonable return on my investment. The personal boundary discussion was tabled until the following week, with my parents reluctantly agreeing to attend at least one therapy session to explore options. As I prepared to leave, Uncle Moses walked me to my car. I'm proud of you, he said quietly. What you're doing here isn't easy. Thank you for your support tonight, I replied. I think they were surprised you didn't automatically take their side. He smiled sadly. Your father and I have had our own difficult history. I recognized some of those patterns in how they've treated you, but never felt it was my place to intervene directly. You supported me in other ways, I assured him. Those weekend visits to your house when things were tense at home, they were breathing space I desperately needed. He squeezed my shoulder affectionately. They do love you, Vivian, in their limited, conditional way. The question is whether they can learn to love the real you, not just the version they've constructed in their minds. That's exactly it, I agreed. And it's not something I can force, only create space for. On the drive home, I reflected on how different this confrontation had felt from our previous encounters. For the first time, I hadn't been desperately seeking their approval or fighting for validation. I had stated my needs clearly, held my boundaries firmly, and remained open to dialogue without compromising my core requirements. The preparation for next week's therapy session would be crucial. This wasn't just about airing grievances or seeking apologies. It was about establishing whether a healthier relationship was even possible. At home, I made notes about key patterns. I wanted to address specific incidents that illustrated the dynamic, and most importantly, my vision for what a healthier relationship might look like. Not idealized fantasy, but realistic possibilities based on who we actually were. I also prepared myself mentally for the possibility that they might refuse to engage meaningfully, might reject the necessary changes, might choose to maintain their narrative even at the cost of genuine connection. The mortgage gave me leverage over their financial situation, but it gave me no power to change their perceptions or behaviors. That reality had to be accepted alongside my hope for transformation. The next morning, I woke early and went for a longer run than usual, processing the events of the previous evening. As I ran along the river path, I found myself thinking about identity. How much of mine had been formed in reaction to my parents' expectations and criticisms. Even my success, in some ways, had been shaped by the drive to prove them wrong. What would it mean to build a life completely free from their influence, neither conforming to nor rebelling against their vision? Back at my apartment, showered and preparing for work, I received a text from my mother. "We've been discussing things further. Your father has made an appointment with his doctor to discuss possible anxiety medication. I've ordered some books on adult parent-child relationships. We're trying, Vivian." The message surprised me. I had expected continued resistance, perhaps passive-aggressive attempts to regain control of the narrative. This tentative step toward self-reflection, however small, suggested possibilities I hadn't fully anticipated. I replied simply, "I appreciate that. See you at the therapy appointment on Tuesday." As I drove to work, I felt a sense of cautious hope. Not naive expectation that decades of patterns would magically transform overnight, but recognition that even small shifts could create openings for new dynamics to emerge. The preparation ahead wasn't just about documenting past hurts or establishing firm boundaries. It was about creating capacity for something new to grow in the space those boundaries protected. The weekend passed quietly as I finalized mortgage paperwork with my attorney and prepared for Tuesday's therapy session. On Monday morning, however, the first real challenge to my new boundaries arrived unexpectedly. I was on a video call with a potential client when Rosalie knocked urgently on my office door. I excused myself briefly, stepping out to find her holding her phone with an odd expression. "Your mother is here," she said. "In our reception area. She's asking to see you." I blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. Did she say why? Something about wanting to talk before the therapy appointment tomorrow. She seems agitated. This was exactly the type of boundary crossing I had addressed in my requirements. Unannounced visits, emotional urgency creating pressure to respond immediately, the old pattern asserting itself in a new context. "Tell her I'm in a client meeting that I can't reschedule," I said calmly. "I can meet her for coffee at 1 p.m. if she's available. Or we can stick with our original plan to talk tomorrow." Rosalie nodded, understanding the significance of my response. "Want me to stay with you for the coffee if she accepts?" "No, but thank you. I need to handle this directly." I returned to my client call, maintaining professional focus despite the emotional disruption waiting in our reception area. This was the first test of whether my boundaries would hold under pressure, whether I could prioritize my established commitments over my mother's emotional urgency. After finishing with the client, I took a moment to center myself before checking Rosalie's update. My mother had agreed to meet at 1 p.m. at the cafe across from our office building. At 1:05, I walked into the cafe deliberately 5 minutes late, not out of petty revenge, but as a small assertion that I would maintain my own schedule rather than dropping everything for her convenience. My mother sat at a corner table, anxiously checking her watch. When she saw me, relief and something like hurt crossed her face. "I thought you might not come," she said as I took my seat. "I said I would," I replied simply, ordering coffee from the passing server. "What was so urgent that it couldn't wait? Until tomorrow?" She twisted her napkin between her fingers, a nervous habit I remembered from childhood. "Your father is having second thoughts about the therapy appointment. I'm afraid he won't come." "I see. And you came to my office unannounced." "Because Because I'm trying, Vivian. A note of frustration entered her voice. I'm trying to make this work, to rebuild our relationship, but Harry is... She trailed off. Dad is being dad, I finished for her. Resistant to anything that challenges his perspective or control. She didn't deny it, which was itself a small victory for honesty. What exactly are you hoping I'll do with this information? I asked directly. I thought maybe you could call him, talk to him. He might listen to you if... Mom, I interrupted gently but firmly. That's not how this works. I've set clear boundaries and expectations. Attending the therapy session is one of them. If Dad chooses not to come, that's his decision, and it will determine what kind of relationship is possible moving forward. So it's all or nothing? He either does exactly what you want or you'll cut us off again? The coffee arrived, giving me a moment to consider my response. This was the crux of the challenge, the attempt to frame my boundaries as unreasonable demands, to position me as the inflexible one. It's not about doing what I want, I explained, meeting her gaze. It's about demonstrating commitment to addressing unhealthy patterns. The therapy session isn't punishment. It's an opportunity to build something better with professional guidance. He's from a different generation, Vivian. Men his age don't talk about feelings in front of strangers. I smiled, slightly. And yet they somehow manage to adapt to all kinds of other changes when they're important enough. Dad figured out smartphones, online banking, and video calling with clients. He can figure out therapy if he actually wants a relationship with his daughter. She looked down at her coffee, silent for a moment. When she looked up, there was a new awareness in her expression. You're different, she said quietly. Not just successful, but certain. When did that happen? It's been happening gradually for 3 years, I replied honestly. But it crystallized when I heard Dad calling me worthless to the neighbors while I was arranging to save your house. She winced. He didn't mean it the way it sounded. That's the thing, Mom. He did. You both did. You've always meant the criticisms, the comparisons, the dismissals. You just wrapped them in, we want what's best for you packaging to make them seem like love. For perhaps the first time in our relationship, I saw her truly considering my perspective rather than immediately defending her own. I don't know how to be different, she admitted after a long pause. Being your mother has always been about guiding you, shaping you. If I can't do that, who am I to you? The vulnerability in her question caught me off guard. I had prepared for resistance, defensiveness, even manipulation, but not for genuine confusion about how to relate to me as an adult. You could be someone who celebrates my successes without qualification, I suggested. Someone who listens without immediately offering corrections. Someone who sees me clearly rather than through the lens of who you think I should be. She absorbing this, her expression uncertain. And you think this therapist can help us learn? How to do that? I think she can help us try if everyone is willing. My mother took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders with familiar determination. I'll make sure your father is there, whatever it takes. Mom, I said carefully. It's important that he comes because he's choosing to, not because you've pressured or manipulated him. That would just be perpetuating old patterns. She appeared genuinely surprised by this caveat. Then how am I supposed to convince him? You're not. You can share your own desire to improve your relationship with me, your own commitment to the process, but his choice needs to be his. She shook her head slightly, bemused. When did you become so wise about all this? When I stopped trying, to make you see me and started seeing myself clearly instead. We finished our coffee with lighter conversation about neutral topics, her garden, my recent weekend trip to the coast. As we prepared to leave, she hesitated, then asked, If your father doesn't come tomorrow? Then you and I will still have our session, I said firmly. My relationship with each of you isn't contingent on the other's choices. The relief in her eyes was palpable. She had expected an ultimatum, consistent with the all-or-nothing thinking that had characterized our family's approach to conflict. "I'll see you tomorrow then," she said, her voice steadier. One way or another. As I watched her leave, I realized I had just navigated the first real challenge to my new boundaries. Not perfectly, perhaps, but authentically. I had neither capitulated to emotional pressure nor responded with defensive anger. I had simply held my position with clarity and compassion. Whether my father attended tomorrow's session or not, something had already shifted between my mother and me. A small opening where honesty had momentarily replaced pretense, where real connection had briefly surpassed performance. It wasn't resolution, but it was movement. And for today, that was enough. Tuesday arrived with a sense of looming significance. The therapy appointment was scheduled for 6 p.m., and despite my outward calm, I felt the weight of anticipation building throughout. The day? Would my father show up? Would this be the beginning of genuine change, or simply a more sophisticated version of the same old patterns? I had prepared thoroughly, reviewing notes on specific incidents I wanted to address and the patterns they represented. I had even role-played difficult conversations with Rosalie to practice maintaining boundaries without becoming defensive. Yet underneath all the preparation lay a current of emotion I couldn't fully rationalize away. However much I had grown, however clear my boundaries had become, these were still my parents. The little girl who had desperately sought their approval still existed somewhere inside me, her hopes and hurts never completely resolved. At 5:15 p.m., as I was wrapping up work before heading to the therapist's office, my phone rang. My father's name appeared on the screen. I took a steadying breath before answering. "Hello, Dad." Vivian. His voice was formal, controlled. "I'm calling about this evening's appointment." I waited, already anticipating what was coming. "I've been giving this considerable thought," he continued, "and I've decided that while I support the idea of improved communication, I don't believe involving a stranger in private family matters is appropriate or necessary." There it was. The expected resistance, wrapped in seemingly reasonable language. "I understand you feel that way," I replied evenly. "And you're making a choice that will determine what kind of relationship is possible between us moving forward." "That sounds like an ultimatum," he said, an edge entering his voice. "It's a boundary, Dad. Something I've needed to establish for a very long time." "Your mother will still be attending," he added, as if granting a concession. "She can represent our perspective." The familiar pattern was emerging, refusing direct engagement while expecting my mother to manage the emotional labor of the relationship. But something in his tone caught my attention. A hint of uncertainty beneath the controlled facade. "I'm disappointed," I said honestly. Not angry, just disappointed. This was an opportunity to build something better. A pause. "I've managed relationships for 63 years without professional intervention, Vivian. I don't see why this should be different." "Because what you've been managing isn't a relationship, Dad. It's a dynamic where you maintain control and others adjust to accommodate you." The silence that followed was heavy. I'd never spoken to him with such direct honesty before. "I need to go," he finally said. "Your mother will see you at 6. After he hung up, I sat for a moment, processing the conversation. The expected disappointment was there, but alongside it was something unexpected, a sense of clarity and even relief. I had spoken my truth without anger or defensiveness. I had maintained my boundary while remaining open to connection. Whether he realized it or not, my father had just demonstrated exactly why the therapy was necessary. When I arrived at the therapist's office, Dr. Emerson, a warm woman in her 50s with calm, perceptive eyes, greeted me in the waiting room. "Your mother arrived a few minutes ago," she explained. "She mentioned your father won't be joining us. Would you still like to proceed with the session?" Absolutely, I confirmed. My relationship with each of my parents exists independently of the other. Dr. Emerson led me to a comfortable room where my mother sat perched on the edge of a sofa, tension evident in her posture. When she saw me, relief washed over her face. She had clearly feared I might not come once my father backed out. "Thank you for being here," I said, taking a seat across from her rather than beside her. Close enough for connection, but with clear space between us. "Your father wanted me to tell you he's not refusing to work on things," she began immediately. "He just prefers to do it directly, without intermediaries," Dr. Emerson gently redirected. "Perhaps we could start by having each of you share what you hope to accomplish through these sessions." What followed was the most honest conversation my mother and I had ever had. With Dr. Emerson's skilled facilitation, we began untangling decades of miscommunication and unmet expectations. "I never understood why nothing we did seemed good enough for you," I explained at one point. The goalpost kept moving. A 98 on a test would prompt questions about the missing 2 points rather than celebration of achievement. My mother looked genuinely perplexed. "We were trying to push you toward excellence, to help you reach your full potential. But the message I received was that I was never enough as I was, that my worth was conditional on achievement." Dr. Emerson interjected gently. "Lorna, can you hear how your intentions created a different impact than you expected?" My mother hesitated, then nodded slowly. I can see how it might have felt that way to Vivian. It wasn't full acknowledgement, but it was a start. An opening where my reality could at least exist alongside hers, rather than being dismissed entirely. As the session progressed, the tension mounted when we reached the topic of my father's absence. "Harry feels attacked," my mother explained, defensive once more. "He believes you're using this financial situation to force changes in your relationship." "I'm using the situation to establish necessary boundaries," I corrected. "There's a difference." "But conditionally helping with the mortgage." "Mom?" I interrupted firmly. "The mortgage modification has been signed. Those terms are established regardless of whether Dad attends therapy. What's conditional is the nature of our personal relationship moving forward." Dr. Emerson asked thoughtfully, "Vivian, what would a healthy relationship with your father look like to you, ideally?" I considered this carefully. One where he sees me as an autonomous adult whose choices deserve respect, even when they differ from what he would choose. Where he can express pride in my accomplishments without immediately finding something to criticize. Where disagreement doesn't mean disappointment. My mother's eyes filled with tears. "He does love you, Vivian. We both do. We've just never known how to show it in ways you could recognize." The raw emotion in her voice caught me off guard. For the first time, I glimpsed how lost my parents might actually feel, clinging to control because they had no other model for parental love. "Love without respect isn't enough," I said gently. "And that's what's been missing. Basic respect for who I actually am, not who you wish I would be." When the session ended, Dr. Emerson suggested we continue with weekly appointments. My mother agreed immediately, adding, "I'll talk to Harry. I can't promise anything, but I'll try." In the parking lot afterward, my mother lingered by my car. "This was harder than I expected," she admitted, "but also clarifying somehow." "It's just the beginning," I reminded her. "Real change takes time and consistent effort." "I know," she hesitated, then added, "Your father isn't as inflexible as he seems, Vivian. He's struggled since his company downsized him last year. His pride, it's all he feels he has left sometimes." This was new information, a piece of context I hadn't known about their financial difficulties. "That explains some things," I acknowledged, "but it doesn't excuse how he's treated me." "No," she agreed surprisingly. "It doesn't. I just wanted you to understand there's more happening than you might realize." As I drove home, The conversation replayed in my mind. The tension between us had shifted, not dissolved, but transformed into something more honest, more grounded in reality, rather than performance and pretense. My father's absence was both a disappointment and a stark illustration of exactly the dynamic I was trying to change. His resistance highlighted how threatening honest communication felt to someone who had maintained control through emotional distance and judgment. The question now was whether my mother's tentative steps toward insight could continue without his participation, and whether she could establish her own relationship with me independent of his influence. The foundations were shifting beneath our family structure. What would remain standing when the tremors subsided remained to be seen. For the next 2 weeks, a new pattern established itself. My mother attended therapy sessions faithfully, gradually showing more willingness to examine our family dynamics. My father remained conspicuously absent, communicating only through my mother about mortgage-related matters. The modified mortgage agreement was being processed, the financial aspect of our situation stabilizing. But the personal aspects remained in flux, with my father's resistance creating an unresolved tension that hung over every interaction. Then, on a Wednesday evening, I received an unexpected text from my father. "Need to speak with you directly. Will be at your office tomorrow at 4 p.m. No request, no question. Just the expectation that I would accommodate his schedule." The old pattern asserting itself, I replied simply, "I have meetings until 5. I can meet you at 5:30 p.m. in the coffee shop across the street." His response came quickly. "Fine." I shared the development with Rosalie the next morning. "My father's finally making an appearance." "Want me to accidentally interrupt if things get too intense?" she offered. I smiled at her protectiveness. "No, but thank you. This confrontation has been coming for weeks. It's time to see if anything can actually change." Throughout the day, I maintained focus on my work while mentally preparing for the meeting ahead. Unlike our previous interactions, where I had often been caught off guard by my father's critiques, I was now stepping into this confrontation with clear boundaries and expectations. At 5:25, I crossed the street to the coffee shop. My father was already there, seated at a corner table, checking his watch, his habitual gesture of impatience, suggesting that others were wasting his valuable time. "Dad," I greeted him neutrally, taking the seat across from him. He nodded stiffly, his expression unreadable. "Vivian?" For a moment, neither of us spoke. I deliberately waited, refusing to fill the uncomfortable silence as I would have in the past. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Your mother thinks I'm being stubborn." "And what do you think?" I asked. His eyes narrowed slightly, unused to having his statements answered with questions rather than immediate acquiescence. "I think this situation has gotten out of hand," he replied. "What began as a financial arrangement has turned into psychological warfare." The characterization was so dramatically distorted that I almost laughed. Instead, I kept my voice steady. "Requesting honest communication and respect isn't warfare, Dad. It's the bare minimum for a healthy relationship." "We raised you for 18 years, he countered. "Provided everything you needed. And now we're being subjected to interrogation about our parenting by strangers?" I took a slow breath, recognizing the familiar pattern, framing his parental role as a sacrifice that placed me in perpetual debt, one that required eternal gratitude regardless of how he had treated me. "The therapy isn't about assigning blame for the past," I explained. "It's about creating a healthier relationship moving forward, one where I'm treated as an adult rather than a perpetual disappointment." His jaw tightened. "We've always wanted what's best for you." "I believe you think that's true," I acknowledged. "But your version of what's best has never included what I actually want or who I actually am." He sat back, visibly struggling with this perspective. "So all these years, you've secretly resented us? Built this successful life while harboring all this anger?" "It wasn't secret, Dad. I tried telling you many times how your criticism affected me. You just weren't listening. And now you're punishing us, using our financial situation as leverage. Here, it was, the core of his resistance, the belief that my boundaries were actually revenge, that asserting my needs was inherently punitive to him. I've separated the financial arrangement from our personal relationship, I reminded him. The mortgage modification is proceeding regardless of whether you attend therapy. What's conditional is the nature of our relationship moving forward. He leaned forward, his expression hardening. Let me be clear about something, Vivian. I won't be manipulated or controlled, not even by my own daughter. That's exactly what I've been saying to you, I replied calmly. For my entire life, I've been manipulated and controlled by my father. The difference is, I'm not asking you to change who you are. I'm simply establishing how I will and won't be treated. Something shifted in his expression, a momentary crack in the facade of certainty. For perhaps the first time, he was seeing me not as an extension of himself or a project to be managed, but as a separate person with legitimate boundaries. Your mother says you believe we think you're worthless. His voice had lost some of its defensive edge. Is that really what you think of us? That we don't value our own daughter? The directness of the question caught me slightly off guard. I considered my response carefully. I think you value achievement, compliance, and meeting expectations. When I failed to deliver those things exactly as you wanted, your disappointment was palpable. The message wasn't that I was worthless as a whole person, but that my worth was conditional on performing to your standards. He was silent for a long moment, looking down at his untouched coffee. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Do you know why I pushed you so hard? He asked quietly. Because you wanted me to succeed, I answered, the familiar explanation. He shook his head slightly. Because I was terrified you wouldn't, that you'd end up struggling like I did. This was new territory, my father speaking about his own fears rather than my shortcomings. My father told me I'd never amount to anything, he continued, still not meeting my gaze. And for many years he was right. I was 35 before I finally established myself professionally. I didn't want that for you. I wanted to inoculate you against failure by pointing out every possible weakness before it could hurt you. But in doing so, you became the voice telling me I wasn't enough, I said gently. The very thing you were trying to protect me from. He looked up then, something vulnerable in his expression. I never saw it that way. I know. That's why the therapy is so important. It helps us see these patterns from different perspectives. A long silence stretched between us, less tense than before, but heavy with decades of misunderstanding. I'm not going to suddenly become someone who enjoys talking about feelings, my father finally said. That's not who I am. I'm not asking you to become someone else, I assured him. I'm asking for respect, for acknowledgement of my reality, for an attempt to see me clearly rather than through the lens of your fears or expectations. He nodded slowly, considering this. And if I attend one of these sessions, then we'll have taken a first step toward a different kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than authority and compliance. He straightened his shoulders, some of his familiar formality returning. I'll consider it. That's all I can promise right now. It wasn't full acceptance, but it was movement, a crack in the wall of resistance that had seemed impenetrable just hours before. As we prepared to leave, he hesitated, then asked gruffly, The business you've built, it's genuinely successful? I smiled slightly. Yes, Dad. Genuinely successful. Profitable, growing, with a strong client base and excellent reputation. Something like pride flickered across his face before he controlled his expression. Good. That's good. We parted with an awkward handshake rather than the dismissive nod that typically ended our interactions. Not a dramatic transformation, but a subtle shift in the dynamics that had defined our relationship for decades. As I watched him walk away, I realized the confrontation hadn't unfolded as either of us had expected. There had been no dramatic showdown, no emotional catharsis, just the beginning of honest communication between two adults trying to navigate a complicated shared history. Whether this opening would lead to genuine change remained to be seen. But for the first time, I felt the possibility existed. 3 months later, I sat in my office reviewing quarterly projections when Rosalie knocked on my door. "Your parents are here," she announced with raised eyebrows. "Both of them. They say they have news." Unlike my mother's unannounced visit months earlier, this one had been preceded by a text message asking if they could stop by briefly. A small but significant change in respecting boundaries. "Send them in," I said, closing my laptop. They entered together, my mother smiling tentatively, my father maintaining his usual reserved expression but lacking the defensiveness that had characterized him for so long. "Sorry to interrupt your workday," my mother began, taking a seat when I gestured toward the chairs across from my desk. "We wanted to share something in person." My father cleared his throat. "The house is on the market. Of all the news I might have expected, this wasn't it." "You're selling? Why?" "The mortgage modification should have made the payments manageable." 1 year after purchasing my parents' mortgage, I stood in front of a packed auditorium, preparing to deliver the keynote address at the Women in Business Leadership Conference. The journey that had begun with a painful video and a financial transaction had led me to unexpected places, not just in my relationship with my parents, but in my understanding of myself. As I looked out at the audience of aspiring entrepreneurs and established business leaders, I saw reflected in their faces the same questions that had defined my own journey. How do we define our worth? Who gets to determine our value? How do we build success without carrying forward the wounds of the past? Before I discuss business strategies and growth metrics, I began, I want to share a personal story about the most important negotiation I've ever conducted, the one where I finally established the true value of my own worth. For the next 20 minutes, I shared a carefully curated version of my journey. The childhood of conditional approval, the professional success built in defiance of expectations, and the ultimate confrontation that had led to transformation. I spoke about boundaries, about the courage required to speak truth to those who had defined your earliest understanding of yourself. The most valuable asset in any negotiation, I concluded, isn't financial leverage or strategic positioning. It's absolute clarity about your non-negotiables, the boundaries you won't cross, the treatment you won't accept, the values you refuse to compromise. The standing ovation that followed was gratifying, but the conversations afterward were what truly mattered. Women of all ages approached me with tears in their eyes, sharing their own stories of struggling to define themselves, apart from others' expectations. "How did you find the courage to confront your parents like that?" one young entrepreneur asked me. I realized that continuing to seek their approval on their terms was costing me more than facing their disappointment, I answered honestly. Sometimes, the most difficult boundaries to establish are with the people who have known us the longest. Later that evening, as I drove home from the conference, I reflected on how much had changed in a year. My parents had settled comfortably into their townhouse, gradually building a lifestyle more aligned with their actual preferences rather than external expectations. Our relationship had continued to evolve, not without occasional tensions, but with a fundamental shift toward mutual respect that made those tensions navigable. Crawford Consulting had expanded to a team of 15, with a second office opening in the neighboring state. The success I had once pursued, partly to prove my parents wrong, now existed independently of their validation, a purpose unto itself rather than a response to criticism. Most significantly, I had developed a deeper understanding of the patterns that had shaped not just my family dynamics, but so many relationships in my life. The tendency to seek validation from those least willing to provide it. The habit of measuring my worth through others' assessments. The automatic assumption that criticism from authority figures must contain objective truth. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a package on my porch. Inside was a framed photograph I recognized from my childhood, me at about 10 years old, proudly displaying a science project ribbon. A note in my mother's handwriting was attached. Found this while unpacking. Thought you might want it for your office. You've always had that look of determination, even then. Love, Mom. The simple acknowledgement of my persistence, without qualification or redirection, represented a small but meaningful shift in how she saw me. My phone buzzed with a text from Rosalie. Heard your speech was amazing. Not surprised. Proud to be your business partner and friend. These were the relationships I had built in adulthood. Connections based on genuine appreciation rather than conditional approval. The foundation of a life defined by authentic values rather than inherited expectations. That night, sitting on my balcony with a glass of wine, I found myself thinking about worthiness. How we determine it, how we express it, how we reclaim it when others have tried to define it for us. My parents had labeled me worthless because I hadn't conformed to their specific vision of success. They had measured my value against a standard I had never agreed to, using metrics that had little to do with my actual strengths and contributions. The journey of the past year hadn't been about proving them wrong, though financial success had certainly challenged their assessment. It had been about recognizing that their evaluation had always been fundamentally flawed. Not because I was actually valuable according to some objective measure, but because worthiness isn't something that requires external validation at all. My worth wasn't determined by my parents' approval, my company's revenue, or even the standing ovation at today's conference. It existed independently of all external metrics, an inherent quality that could be recognized or denied by others, but never actually diminished. If you're watching this and recognizing parts of your own story in mine, I want you to hear something clearly. You are not worthless. Not by any meaningful measure of that word. Your value isn't determined by parents who couldn't see past their own expectations. It isn't measured by relationships where love is conditional on performance. It isn't calculated through comparison with others whose journeys look nothing like yours. The people who declare you worthless are telling you more about their own limitations than about your potential. They're revealing the narrowness of their vision, not the boundaries of your worth. I purchased my parents' mortgage not to punish them or control them, but to create enough leverage to finally be heard, to establish boundaries that should have existed all along. Not everyone has that specific opportunity, but everyone has the capacity to recognize when relationships have become transactional rather than nurturing. The hardest truth I had to accept wasn't that my parents had undervalued me. It was that I had internalized their assessment, carrying it forward in how I approached relationships, work, and my sense of self. Breaking that pattern required not just confronting them, but confronting the voice inside me that still spoke in their critical tones. Whatever path brought you to this story, whatever words have been used to diminish you, whatever standards have been imposed without your consent, know this: you have the authority to redefine the terms, to establish boundaries that protect your inherent worth, to build connections with people who recognize your value without requiring you to constantly prove it. Your worth isn't a negotiation. It's not determined by consensus or contingent on performance. It's your birthright, unchanged by others' inability to see it clearly. The journey with my parents continues to evolve. There are still moments when old patterns threaten to reassert themselves, when criticism masquerades as concern, when boundaries require reinforcement. But the fundamental dynamic has shifted from performance and evaluation to increasingly authentic connection. Last month, my father attended the opening of our new office location. As he looked around at what I had built, he said something I never expected to hear from him. "I was wrong about your business idea. You saw possibilities I couldn't see." The acknowledgement wasn't delivered with dramatic emotion. That's not who he is, even now. But the simple recognition of my vision, offered without qualification, represented growth I once thought impossible. My mother has found unexpected fulfillment in volunteering at a women's business mentorship program, channeling her energies into supporting others rather than managing appearances. When I visited their townhouse recently, I noticed how much more at ease she seemed, how much less concerned with external validation. As for me, I continue to build my business according to my own vision, maintain relationships that nurture rather than diminish, and establish boundaries that protect the authentic self I've worked so hard to reclaim. The mortgage that once symbolized control and conditional worth has been fully repaid. What remains is something more valuable: the understanding that true worth can't be mortgaged, measured, or manipulated. It simply is. And that insight, more than any financial success or familial reconciliation, is the true inheritance I've claimed for myself. It did, my father acknowledged. But the house, it's too big for just us now, and maintaining it was consuming resources we could better use elsewhere. We found a townhouse in River Heights, my mother added. It's lovely, smaller but with a little garden space for my herbs. River Heights was a pleasant neighborhood of well-maintained townhomes, not as prestigious as their current address, but comfortable and practical. The decision represented a significant shift in priorities. Once the sale closes, we'll pay off the mortgage entirely, my father continued. We wanted you to know that the investment you made will be returned in full, with appropriate interest. I studied them both, noting subtle changes in their demeanor. My father seemed less rigid, my mother less anxious to manage everyone's emotions. The carefully constructed facade they had maintained for decades had softened into something more authentic. This sounds like a practical decision, I said. But I'm curious about the timing. My mother exchanged a glance with my father before responding. The therapy has been illuminating for both of us. She emphasized the last words with a small smile toward my father, who had indeed begun attending sessions after our coffee shop confrontation, albeit initially with reluctance. We've been discussing what truly matters at this stage of our lives, she continued, and we realized we've spent decades prioritizing appearances over substance. My father shifted slightly in his chair. The house was part of that. A status symbol that was costing more than just money. The self-awareness in his statement was striking. After 3 months of weekly therapy, sometimes tense, sometimes revelatory, small changes had accumulated into meaningful shifts in perspective. I'm glad to hear that, I said sincerely. It sounds like you're making choices based on what you actually want, rather than what others expect. We had a good teacher in that regard, my father said, meeting my gaze directly. The acknowledgement, subtle but unmistakable, hung in the air between us. We weren't a family transformed by dramatic revelations or tearful reconciliations. The changes were quieter, more incremental, my father occasionally catching himself before offering unsolicited criticism, my mother learning to express affection without immediate qualification, both of them gradually accepting that my life choices, while different from their expectations, had led to genuine fulfillment. There's something else, my mother said, reaching into her purse. She pulled out a small photo album and handed it to me. We found this while packing. I opened it to find childhood photos I'd never seen before. Moments of unguarded joy, achievement, and even quiet contemplation. Me winning a science competition in 4th grade, building a complex Lego structure with focused determination. Laughing with my first puppy. You kept these? I asked, surprised by the evidence of moments they had apparently valued but never shared. Of course we did, my mother said softly. We've always been proud of you, Vivian. We just didn't know How to show it properly, my father added gruffly. We thought pushing you would make you stronger. We didn't realize you were already strong in ways we couldn't recognize. The acknowledgement wasn't perfect or complete, but it was genuine, a recognition of my reality that had been missing throughout our relationship. As they prepared to leave, my father hesitated, then asked, We're having a small gathering next. Weekend, a farewell to the house of sorts. Would you consider attending? The invitation was presented as a request, rather than an expectation. Another small but significant change. I'd like that, I replied. Thank you for asking. The following weekend, I arrived at my childhood home to find it already showing signs of transition. Some furniture missing, walls bare where family photos had hung, boxes stacked in corners. Yet the atmosphere was lighter somehow, as if the physical unburdening mirrored an emotional one. Nicky was there with her husband, along with Uncle Moses, Nita, and a few other neighbors and family friends. As I mingled, I noticed something striking. The way people interacted with me had shifted. Where there had once been polite distance or awkward references to my parents' expectations, there was now direct engagement with me as an individual. Your mother was just telling me about your company's expansion plans, Nita said, joining me by the refreshment table. She seems genuinely excited about your success. That's a new development, I admitted. Nita smiled knowingly. People can change when the right incentive comes along. For your parents, I think the incentive was the possibility of losing you. Completely. Later, I found myself alone with my father in his study. The room that had once been the most intimidating space in the house for me, where report cards were reviewed and shortcomings cataloged. It's strange to be packing this up, he said, gesturing to the shelves of business books and industry awards. For so long, this room represented who I was. And now? I asked. He considered the question seriously. Now I'm discovering there might be more to me than just professional accomplishment. Your mother says I'm becoming multidimensional. His tone was wry but not dismissive. That sounds like a good thing. It's unfamiliar, he admitted, but not entirely uncomfortable. We stood in companionable silence for a moment, perhaps the first truly comfortable silence we had ever shared. The therapy has been difficult, he said finally. Confronting patterns I've maintained for decades hasn't been pleasant. Growth rarely is, I replied, thinking of my own journey over the past few months. He nodded thoughtfully. I may never be the expressive, emotionally demonstrative father you might have wished for. Some aspects of who I am are deeply ingrained. I'm not asking you to become someone else, I reminded him, just to see and respect who I actually am. I'm trying, he said simply. The admission of effort, without qualification or defensiveness, represented more progress than any dramatic declaration could have. As the gathering wound down, I found myself observing my parents from across the room. They were speaking with Uncle Moses, my mother laughing at something he said, my father's posture more relaxed than I could remember seeing it. They looked older, certainly, and perhaps a bit more vulnerable without the grand house as their backdrop, but also more authentic, less consumed with maintaining appearances. The mortgage that had initially brought us into confrontation was now being resolved through their own choices. The power dynamic had shifted not through my financial leverage, but through the gradual establishment of mutual respect. Our relationship wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, old patterns that threatened to reassert themselves. My father still occasionally slipped into judgment, my mother into anxious management of others' emotions. But now there was awareness of these patterns, acknowledgement when they emerged, and willingness to redirect toward healthier interaction. This was our new reality, not a fairy tale transformation, but a measured evolution toward greater authenticity and respect. The foundations had shifted, and though the structure remained recognizable, its balance had fundamentally changed. As I prepared to leave, my mother hugged me with uncharacteristic openness. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not giving up on us entirely." My father, still uncomfortable with overt emotion, simply shook my hand and said, "We'll see you at dinner next week?" It was phrased as a question rather than an expectation. Another, small victory for boundaries and respect. "Yes," I confirmed, "I'll be there." Driving away from the house for what might be the last time, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: nostalgia for the good moments that had existed alongside the difficult ones, appreciation for the changes we had managed to create together, and most surprisingly, a sense of peace about the past that had previously eluded me. The house that had once represented my parents' expectations and my own perceived inadequacy would soon belong to someone else. And in its place, we were building something more valuable. A relationship based on who we actually were, rather than who we had pretended to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.